Hello, welcome to my video on strict liability offences. So these are a special kind of offence in the law, and to understand a little bit about strict liability offences, you first have to understand generally about how liability works in criminal law. We can roughly split all of our criminal offences into one of three categories. We have specific intent crimes, basic intent crimes, and strict liability crimes. This works on the idea that you need actus reus and mens rea together at the same time. That's called the contemporaneity rule, or coincidence of actus reus and mens rea. But what sort of intent is needed? If it's a specific intent crime, then only intention will do, and that's the top level of mens rea, it's the more serious. Murder is a great example of a specific intent crime. You have to commit the actus reus, which is the unlawful killing of a human being under the Queen's peace, and you must do that with the intent to kill or cause serious harm. Only intent will do. Basic intent crimes don't tend to carry as serious a penalty, and these will accept either intent or recklessness. Recklessness is where you realise there's a risk, but you carry on and go ahead anyway. So, for example, battery is a crime where you apply unlawful force to another, that's the actus reus, and at the same time you either intended to apply unlawful force to another or you realised there was a risk you might and do it anyway. So for example, if you throw a stone at somebody and it hits them, you've applied unlawful force to them and you either intended to, you threw it, or you were throwing a stone, you realise there's a risk of hitting someone because there's someone nearby and you think, oh, I'm going to do it anyway. Strict liability crimes, however, require no mens rea at all. No mens rea at all. All you have to do is commit the actus reus and you will be guilty. The law doesn't care why you did it or how you did it, whether you meant to do it or not. The mere fact that you've broken the rule is enough to prosecute you. Now, as you can hopefully imagine, these are very, very limited circumstances. We don't have many strict liability offences because a key principle of criminal law is we have actus reus and mens rea, a guilty action and a guilty mind at the same time. So why do we have strict liability offences if they go against that core principle? We tend to see them either regulate society by keeping standards high and people safe, or protect the vulnerable of society, where it's so important to protect them that merely committing the offence is enough. There's a key between the two, of course. It's the idea of protecting society by keeping standards high. You can't use excuses. If you break the rules, that's enough. Now, because of that core principle of having the actus reus and mens rea together for most crimes will be specific intent crimes or basic intent crimes. If the court isn't very clear about whether it's a strict liability offence or not, they will generally presume the crime needs actus reus and mens rea. If it's intended to be strict liability, it's usually very, very clear in the wording of the Act of Parliament, and most strict liability crimes are Acts of Parliament. That means that the Houses of Parliament have looked very carefully at this situation and decided that to regulate society or protect the vulnerable, if someone breaks the rule, that is it. We don't care why they broke the rule, just breaking the rule is enough. In the case of Sweet versus Parsley, for example, a woman was prosecuted for managing a property where cannabis was being grown. Now, she argued that she had no idea it was being grown there. The house was let out to students, she didn't visit the property often, and she had no idea. She had no mens rea. And the courts decided that it wasn't very clear whether this was a strict liability offence or not. So they assumed it would not be. They assumed mens rea was needed, and she was found not guilty because she wasn't intending to grow cannabis there, and she didn't realise there was a risk either. She wasn't guilty. However, the case of Gammon versus the Attorney General of Hong Kong gave us some guidance to help the judges decide if maybe it should be a strict liability crime. When should it only be actus reus? Well, the first is if the crime is regulatory in nature. So that means it's very clearly intended to enforce rules and guidance about people's behaviour. Or it should be a strict liability crime if it's an issue of social concern. So to protect society and therefore protect the vulnerable in society, if someone breaks the rules, they should be guilty. Another indication that it is meant to be strict liability is if the wording of the act leads us in that direction, if the wording of the act suggests it should be a strict liability crime. And finally, another indication that perhaps it is strict liability and doesn't need mens rea is if the crime carries a heavy penalty. Now that's important because heavy penalties are put there as a deterrent. They are there to stop people from doing undesirable behaviour, and that's usually to regulate society and protect the vulnerable. So if the court thinks it has a heavy penalty to protect society, that probably suggests it's so important that it should be actus reus only. Otherwise, remember the main presumption, the main rule, your starting point for the court is that we assume you need both together, actus reus and mens rea. So we generally assume crimes are specific intent or basic intent, unless it either says very clearly it is actus reus only, or we have maybe some of these hints in the law. So what sort of situations would we use strict liability offences? Well, you can see some of the key cases here at the bottom that are useful to know about. The first is the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain, which you can shorten to PSGB, versus Stokewayne. Stokewayne was a pharmacist who was supplying prescription medication. Now, he was supplying those to a person with prescriptions, but those prescriptions were forged. Now, they were very, very good forgeries, and the pharmacist had no idea. However, he was charged with supplying drugs without a legal prescription. He's committed the guilty act because he's done that. He's given someone medication that requires a prescription when they don't have one, not a proper one. He argued he had no clue, he had no idea, he didn't intend to do this. He wasn't reckless, he didn't realise there was a risk, they were such good forgeries. However, the court looked at the idea behind the law. Why do we require prescriptions? Well, because these medications are so strong, we need to regulate their use and who takes them. And the court decided this would be a strict liability crime. Sorry, Mr. Pharmacist, sorry, Mr. Stokewayne, it's not very fair on you, but did you commit the actus reus? Yes, therefore you're guilty. We don't actually care if you meant to or not. Similar situation was seen in Callow versus Tilstone. This was a butcher who was charged with selling meat that was unfit for human consumption. Now, he'd actually had the meat certified by a vet, but the vet had made a mistake. The meat was not fit for human consumption. Did he commit the actus reus? Yes, he sold that meat that wasn't fit for human consumption, fit for eating. Did he mean to? No. And he thought it was fine because the vet had told him it was fine. However, the court said that this was a strict liability crime. Food safety and hygiene rules are really, really important. It's really important that we keep food safety standards high for our protection. Therefore, this was a strict liability crime. He committed the actus reus. We didn't care about the mens rea. He was guilty. Harrow London Borough Council versus Shah. The Shahs owned a newsagents that sold lottery tickets. It's against the law to sell a lottery ticket to anybody underage. An underage person bought a lottery ticket despite the fact that the Shahs had tried to train their staff. They were prosecuted, and the court said that this was a strict liability crime because gambling is a social concern. We need to very carefully regulate who gambles to protect the society and to protect vulnerable children from getting addicted. The courts therefore said this was a strict liability offence. Had they committed the actus reus? Yes, because they sold the lottery ticket to someone underage. We didn't care why, and we didn't care how hard they tried to avoid this. The fact was they'd done it. Now, for those of you out there who perhaps have part-time jobs and you work with age-restricted products, maybe tobacco, alcohol, restricted products like games, films, things like that, the rules also apply there, so be aware. It doesn't matter if you try and check ID, perhaps someone gives you a really good forged ID, we don't care. If you break the rule, you'll be prosecuted to protect society. In Alphacell versus Woodward, a business was charged with polluting a river. Now it turns out the machinery that they normally use to filter the pollution from their factory had broken down. They were totally unaware of this, and because it was broken down, the pollution did go into the river. The court said that pollution is a social concern. We need to keep standards high, and there are very heavy penalties for businesses who pollute. And the court said that they were guilty because they polluted the river. Even though they had no clue it was happening, they certainly didn't mean it, the court said guilty. In R versus Blake, Blake ran a pirate radio station without a license. You need a license. He was again charged because we need to protect the radio waves out there because emergency services use radio bands. They may not be able to use that radio band if he's running a radio station on it. So the court said, if he commits the actus reus, we don't care why he did it. He was guilty. In R versus Prince, it was really important to protect the vulnerable people of society. Prince had ran away with a girl who he thought was over 18. And he thought that because she told him, and she looked very, very grown up. He had no clue that she was actually 16. He was found guilty of a crime. He'd committed the actus reus of running away with an underage girl, even though he had no clue, because the girl lied to him. Why? Because this was a strict liability crime. It was important to protect children. So we didn't care about the circumstances surrounding the case. The mere fact that he broke that rule was enough. So strict liability offences are rare. Most crimes are specific or basic intent, needing actus reus and mens rea together. But there are some limited circumstances where it is so paramount to protect society that we allow these cases to happen, where only if you commit the actus reus will you be found guilty. We don't care why you did it, or even if you tried your best to avoid committing the crime. Thank you for watching.